Okay, welcome to the Vermont Climate Council Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting of May 7th, 2021. Hi, everybody. We have just in terms of roll call, it looks like we have Chad Farrell and Mike Burke and Joe Segali and myself and Catherine Dimitrick on. And for members sorry, not Ann Lawless. And so we're just missing a couple of folks, and we'll reach out. We were just talking about reaching out to them to make sure. There's been a couple of folks that haven't been able to make it for a couple of meetings, so we'll just double check that they're getting the invites. On today's agenda, Catherine was so kind to put it in the chat. We have after subcommittee liaison and member updates, we will have a quick run through of the updated climate action plan framework for our review. And then Catherine had the great idea to have a discussion today about the municipal vulnerability assessment and what potential consultant needs we have, and just have a more in-depth discussion around that. And then an update on the Rural Caucus legislators that we'll be talking to next week. So if everybody wants to take a look at the agenda that's posted in the chat, as well as the minutes and from last meeting, and let us know if there's any changes you would wish to make. Go ahead and speak up about that.
The only thing I'm seeing in the chat is a message from Stephanie right now. That could be me.
For some reason, the chat, I find this frustrating, only shows you the chat from when you're signed on. Okay, there you go. You got it.
Yeah, if you sign on after I posted it, then you don't see it. So I just redid it.
There you go.
No changes? Okay, so let's move into our introductions. And I think in the past few weeks, we've been doing some more in-depth introductions, and I think we'll just continue that for the next couple of weeks, because it's been really interesting to hear about the folks on the subcommittee a little bit more in detail. So I think I'm looking at all of the members, and I think we have talked with all of them in detail, at least the ones that are on here. So I'm going to pass it over to some of our staff support because we have a number of them that we have not heard from. So in terms of the staff support for the subcommittee, is anybody willing to talk a little bit more about themselves in depth by way of introduction? Jens?
Greetings, everybody. I'm Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I've worked for the department for about, I think, 14 years now. And my principal role is doing municipal technical assistance. I think I've visited in a work capacity, maybe 200 of the 251. And so I'm typically advising on town plans or zoning regulations or whatever conservation projects they may have going. Generally, these are night meetings with conservation commissions, planning commissions, select boards, that type of thing. There are three other aspects of my work that might be of interest here. I'm one of the developers of Vermont Conservation Design, and I manage the BioFinder website. So that whole vision of a resilient future that's embedded in Vermont Conservation Design is one of the things that's a huge part of my work and what I do day to day, explaining the towns and other people. Another piece of that is working on road ecology issues and working closely with the Agency of Transportation. I worked briefly for VTrans, I don't know what, back in 2011 in their environmental section. And so I do all of the road ecology work between the departments, and so help with the highways and habitats trainings and review development proposals with respect to wildlife passage and that sort of policy work. And then lastly, I do a lot of networking among the conservation community, generally around habitat connectivity. So I'm the coordinator for Vermont Staying Connected Initiative, which is a group of NGOs and state partners focused on habitat connectivity from the Gaspé Peninsula to the Adirondacks and beyond. And so it's an international focus. That also takes me into things like serving on the working group for the New England Governors Eastern Canadian Premiers working group on habitat connectivity. So there's sort of a bunch of different parts of my job that fit into the work here of the subcommittee, of the working group, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to introduce themselves a little bit more in depth?
Erica, I don't think you or I have gone yet.
We'll go right ahead, Catherine.
You don't want to go first?
No, I'll follow you.
All right. So Catherine DeMatrica, my current job is Executive Director of Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and that's probably how many of you know me because I've been at the commission for 26 years. So pretty much, actually, last year I crossed the threshold of having been there more than half my life. So that's pretty exciting times. In my job, I spend a lot of time working with communities, a lot of night meetings also, Jens, working with communities on a host of transportation, emergency management, land use, brownfields redevelopment, community development, grant applications, etc. Just work with all communities on a lot of different topics. My staff says I'm a bit of a board junkie, so I also serve on a lot of boards. I've had the pleasure of serving on a lot, including being chair of BCRD, which was really fun, and Champlain Housing Trust. But currently I serve on the board of United Way of Northwest Vermont and Green Mountain Transit, which is a public transit agency for Franklin, Grand Isle, Chittenden, and Washington counties. In my free time, I like to do a lot of things, but most of my free time is taken up with driving kids places and making sure I have enough food in my house to feed my 16-year-old, 18-year-old, and my bonus son, who's a sophomore in college. So it takes a lot of time to organize and plan food for 3 really big, really active teen men. So that's where I spend my time these days.
Thanks. I can empathize with that. Yeah, so Erica Bormann, I am the Director of Vermont Emergency Management. I started with VEM in 2007 as an intern and kind of worked my way up the ranks, first as a planner and EM specialist working in the radiological emergency response program, and then doing all hazards planning. And then spent some time as planning chief where I was overseeing state level emergency planning, chief of staff for first Director Joe Flynn when he was the Director of Vermont Emergency Management, and then Chris Herrick when he was the Director of Vermont Emergency Management, and both of which have now been appointed to other positions in the state government. And then in 2017, I was appointed by Governor Scott as the director. I currently serve as the U.S. co-chair for the International Emergency Management Group, and I am the vice president of the National Emergency Management Association, which is a association of all of the directors of emergency management within the U.S. I'm currently serving my 2nd year as vice president because COVID messed up our rotation and conferences schedule. So they're like, go ahead, you can be the vice president for another year and president next year. So looking forward to moving into the president spot and in bringing 500 of our closest national emergency management friends to Vermont next year. When I am not staying busy with emergency management things, which are many, I have two boys that are 7 and 9, and they love playing hockey and baseball. So I do a lot of shuttling around of them. And my husband, who maybe also is another dependent, who runs his own business, actually runs his own solar business. So I get to hear a lot about solar installation and all of that. So, and we live in Hyde Park and just built our first house. Well, we had lived in Morrisville and bought our first house, and then we built a house last year, and are lucky enough to live in a green home that doesn't rely whatsoever on fossil fuels. So, so anyway, that's a little bit about me, and I think that's all I have. Sometimes it's hard to remember things when you're talking about yourself. So great. Okay. So that was 3 introductions. So why don't we move on to our subcommittee liaison and member updates. Chad, do you want to kick us off on?
So there was no meeting. It's an every other week for the
okay.
cross-sector mitigation. So there'll be another meeting next week. Just again, the ask is that we share our work plan with them at some point. So whenever we feel like that's in good enough shape, I saw one of the other liaisons from Science and Technology, Jared, shared theirs. So just that's on the to-do list.
Yeah.
We feel it's in good enough shape to share even as a draft.
I have shared it as is right now. I shared all the existing work plans before Jared had actually shared the science and data with Richard and Peter and Joey Miller, who's sort of Richard and Joey and I are meeting on Monday to talk about work planning for cross-sector mitigation.
Great.
To bring forward a template recommended for their meeting next Thursday.
Okay. Sounds good. That's all I
Right,
have.
so I don't have to put it on my to-do list again. Then we're good. Great, thank you.
Great. I know Marion had an item that she wanted to bring to our attention and touch on lately, and I think we'll probably want to have some agenda time to talk about that more in depth. But Marion, did you want to discuss that?
Certainly, and I'll let Joe and Mike fill in as needed as subcommittee members. But our inventory working group met on Monday to discuss the adaptation and resiliency inventory. But we also spent some time talking about the other tasks under our sort of first work area in the work plan, one of which is to list the threats and hazards using a number of factors. And I think one of the things and the questions we had both for the subcommittee and that may need to be elevated to the Climate Council is where do we sort of expand that list of threats and hazards beyond what's listed in statute? So a couple of subcommittee meetings ago, CBI did some brainstorming with us, Pat Field did, where we listed a number of threats and hazards and sort of talked about some of those impacts and listing those out. And I think we had a good list started, but we as a smaller working group had some questions about, where's our authority to sort of expand the list of threats and hazards beyond what's listed in statute, because there is a definite list in the Global Warming Solutions Act. I did also email Catherine and Erica about the agriculture and ecosystems having a separate list, although upon further discussion with and emailing with Joe, I don't actually think they have their own list. They have sort of some nature-based hazards listed in their multi-criteria assessment tool, but it's not really a list of threats and hazards. So I think, and maybe Jane can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're the only subcommittee that's really doing that, but I still think it warrants some discussion about sort of, to what extent do we expand that beyond what's in the act, and you know, how far do we go, I think is maybe one of the questions, but I'll let Joe and Mike fill in as well.
No, that was perfect. That was a question. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think this is an important piece here, especially because this is going to feed into a lot of different things that we're talking about, the Municipal Vulnerability Index, and many other things. And when we talk about the threats and hazards that are posed to Vermont communities, specifically by climate change or are exacerbated by climate change, I think we need to probably spend some time talking through those. That's something that, you know, I know that we have a list of in the SEMP, the State Emergency Management Plan. That may not be an all-inclusive list as it relates to climate change, though. So we may want to think about that. And I think, you know, since we have this crew on this committee with this level of expertise, I think actually folks would probably look to us to develop the definitive list, and then have that carry forward to any of the other subcommittees. The other thing that we may we probably want to get some input on is from a science and data subcommittee, and I think Jay could probably help us with that. Jay Schaefer. What do
So should
committee
we
members think about that?
So maybe it's just dedicating, you know, a half hour at one of our meetings to kind of, I know we did that brainstorming session 2 meetings ago, but I think that was just really a exercise. It wasn't, you know, sort of final or anything like that. And so maybe if we could schedule a time on the agenda, then maybe our little working group could do some work ahead of time to pull some ideas together based on everything you just said, plus whatever else is out there, like the National Climate Assessment has some things specific to the Northeast that we should probably look at to make sure they're covered or not. So I think does that seem reasonable that we just schedule time and focus on it? Maybe not in the not too distant future.
Yeah. Agreed. Jane?
Okay, so bear with me for a minute because my thoughts might be a little jumbled, but I hope that this is sort of like gets at some bigger questions that I've been thinking about for this group. So I think this is Marianne, Joe, and Mike's comments really relate to a conversation that I had yesterday with Leslie Ann for an hour. I think you all don't know her. She's the state climatologist. She's a council member. And she was sort of struggling with the way the climate action plan is drafted right now, and how we sort of tee up the why, like why should we care, and like thinking of speaking to the National Climate Assessment, then more specifically about Vermont. And so she's helping me sort of refine, you know, there's that beginning part of the draft that talks about the effects of climate change, but really sort of building out from that about how we sort of create the underpinning of, like, you know, why do we need to cut emissions, and then why is emissions cutting not enough, and why do we also have to be thinking about resiliency planning and adaptation to complement that, as well as sequestration. And so it also gets at your conversation on the agenda today for the Municipal Vulnerability Index, and it sort of relates to my, like, in all other states where there are climate action plans, there are like separate vulnerability plans and vulnerability analyses at a much broader level than just like municipal. So it sort of gets at the question of, like, what outside of scope are we looking at with threats? Well, what are we also thinking about when we think about a vulnerability index? And it kind of relates to what do we know? And I think we'll start to think about that. Like, I know Mike, like there are people in the utility like thinking about this, but that's like one component. And then what's the bigger picture of that? And what do we need to think about perhaps for some other contractual work around that to inform like how we connect this to people? Because I'm starting to really understand and relate as we think more about public engagement. And we'll talk about this next week when the public engagement consultants join you for your subcommittee meeting. about like everything I hear from them is that's how we're going to connect people to like caring about this, right? Is the understanding about the threats and the vulnerabilities and like how we become more resilient and adapt, as well as like slow it down through emissions cutting. So it's just a placeholder for me to say, I think that that's a really on point comment from Joe and Marianne and Mike. And I think that the scale of what we're thinking about with all of these issues, it could be really big and should be likely to connect Vermonters into the work. So I look forward to talking about the municipal vulnerability indices and what we know and don't know, and what we think we should get to, and how to frame some questions around that, perhaps with the council or others to think about. So thanks.
Yeah, definitely putting a pin in that whole comment for our discussion about municipal vulnerability index and contract support, because I think you're right. I think it's bigger. Okay, so I've got a couple of to-dos on outlining some time for us to discuss the list of threats and hazards specifically for climate change in Vermont, and going a little bit more in depth about those. Okay.
And we can flip the order if it makes more sense to start talking about the municipal vulnerability assessment. Consultant needs to follow up on that comment. Mike.
Yeah, we did meet a small group of us yesterday, and then Chad and I have communicated a little via email. And when we did meet, we looked at the index that has already been done statewide based on the CDC socioeconomic look, as well as communications and reliability. And Ann and I were actually talking about possibly having the people that built that come and show it to the council if we could get some time in the future, and show everyone how that works, and then possibly maybe just hand that over to the consultant if we decide to use the consultant to run with it and add more to it. So, for instance, it doesn't have transportation vulnerabilities, which we know we probably want to add, and then any others that might be out there. But it is a pretty comprehensive list already that does cover 100% of the state for the CDC guidelines and the communication. It would just be reliability in the electric sector that we would have to expand it out more to include everyone and not just GMP. So that was something we wanted to throw out there versus starting right from scratch with a consultant. And I don't know if you'd add anything more to that, or Chad, I know we didn't quite connect yesterday, but that was in the email.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything more on that as of yet.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that we can use it as a starting point, not starting from scratch. As Mike said, that GMP's put a fair bit of thought into this, but it doesn't mean there aren't other ideas in terms of how to make it better, or especially to capture kind of the equity piece. There may be other thoughts on that. So we thought at least if we could shop it around with this group, and then if folks were comfortable with it, or made a list of areas where we'd like to see improvements, that could be at least a partially started piece of work that we could hand to the consultant to brush up.
I think that would be a really helpful way to get started, to see how that works, what's included in it, and understand what's been done so far in the context of what we all think we might need. I think that would be great. What do others think?
I think it should, yeah, absolutely be looked at. But if we do bring it, like if we have to do this just on our own, then let's take something like that and go for it. But if we are going to bring some consultant support on board, I mean, it's probably worthwhile to see how other vulnerability indices are done in different places, and and then sort of stack that up against it, and then just maybe that can either suggest some improvements to it, or or some other direction. But I don't know if there's enough. I mean, I'm thinking in a perfect world, we would have time to like do this in a deliberative, careful way. So I don't know if there's really enough time to do that or not. So, but maybe at least with consultants, they can, if they have experience in this area, they might say, yeah, that's great, let's go for it, but you just need to tweak this, that, and other thing. Or they might say, here's another tool that could do it. So, so I don't think we should settle on it just yet until we kind of know what's happening with a consultant.
Anne?
I just have a question. I missed the first part of what you said, Joe. So just to clarify, are we talking about looking at the VEM, Vermont Emergency Management Vulnerability Index, and also, sort of combining a look at the GMP one? And those would be our starting points, as well as, I liked your suggestion, Joe, to see how others do this and what ours might be missing. Am I on track with that?
We've got a couple of different things here being discussed here. One is outlining the kind of definitive list of threats and hazards that are posed specifically and exacerbated to Vermont communities by climate change. But what we've really also started discussing here is, where we can have, what's the starting point for developing a municipal vulnerability index?
Yep.
I think the thing that the piece that I'd like to expand on here is the fact that when we talk about indices and we talk about assessments, it's a little bit they're different things. Doing a vulnerability assessment for is looking at risk times probability with the context of that threat or hazard against certain sectors of our infrastructure. So maybe it's just municipal infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, communications infrastructure, social vulnerability constructs, and I think when we look at a municipal vulnerability index, which what we're charged to do, we would be remiss if we missed out on conducting an overarching vulnerability assessment that was targeted toward climate change. And so when we talk about, since we're on this topic now, so we'll just move right into this agenda item. When we talk about bringing on contract support for municipal vulnerability index and having a contractor do the research, make recommendations to the subcommittee about how an index can be developed for municipalities in Vermont, I think we do want to include in that scope of work upfront a vulnerability assessment that is targeted toward climate change. We have done assessments at VEM kind of at a high level, and they're included in the state emergency management plan under the hazard mitigation section, as well as the prevention protection section. But this is a different flavor that we would want to have a more in-depth look at, I think.
Sounds good.
Hey, Ben, so you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I have a question about this topic, and I'm not sure what you'll do with it, but I know that the municipal vulnerability assessment is one of our legislated tasks, so we can't really quibble with it. But I want to quibble a little bit with the way this is framed, because what we see, if we do a perfect municipality versus municipality vulnerability assessment, we're going to come up with something that looks kind of like ERAF, where we have some communities that rank higher than others. And then what? My concern is that to look at vulnerability, we may want to look at things other than municipal jurisdictional distinctions because there's more variability within each community in terms of vulnerability than there is between communities. Every community in the state has people who are very vulnerable to climate change and other people who are in pretty good shape. Think about Hyde Park. And so I know we have to do the municipality versus municipality matrix, but there are other matrices about how people who live in mobile homes stack up against people who live in their own homes versus how people who live in rental housing stack up. And you can come up with some other criteria that may be more useful to us in terms of policy making. So I hope we don't lose sight of that three-dimensionality of the vulnerability assessment task.
Thanks for bringing that up, Ben. I'm confident we're not going to lose sight of it because I think somebody in this group brings that up every time we talk about this. So there's definitely a theme that's been echoed in all of our conversations about this, of how to meet the statutory requirement, but recognize it's, and I think the language we use in the work plan is communities or parts of communities. And then we added some language about community in the small scale, like groups of people or individual characteristics of households that may impact your vulnerability. So definitely agree, Ben. What do others think about what Ben had to say?
It's interesting. I agree with Ben there too. For a minute, I thought Ben was going that it's beyond the borders of municipalities, not just within. And I was, some of the indexes we've already done, do show the beyond the border thing. A whole county may be more susceptible than other counties. So, but I agree with Ben 100% too. I think it goes both ways, the smaller and the larger.
I just want to echo that. I think it's important to look beyond and within. In terms of the beyond, I think one of the things that might come up is utility by utility specific vulnerabilities and attributes, I guess, for lack of a better word, opportunities and challenges, let's use that terminology. And then also, if we're layering on the telecom piece, there's some, we've had this discussion with GMP, there's some specific areas where if there's only fiber broadband connection and some of the copper telephone lines have been pulled out, it's a very specific telecommunications issue in one specific telecommunications territory, but that is actually creates some vulnerabilities from communications and connectedness perspective as well. So you can't just automatically equate fiber connection with more opportunities and more robustness of communications infrastructure. It's actually can be a detriment when there's no kind of redundancy with another system. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at it. And then sort of within the municipality, it might help to hear kind of how GMP is plans to use the index that they've come up with and the prioritization to actually lead to specific investments or projects. Is it something to benefit the electric reliability of the entire town, for instance, if they really are challenged in that regard, or can it be used to drill down to those specific areas of town where there's more of a threat to electric resilience or reliability, and to really target investments there? Or are the investments, are we layering on critical facilities when we define those to say, really the investment should be to make sure every critical facility, grocery store, emergency shelter, however we define those, has some sort of redundant backup storage system or something like that. So I think there's a lot of ways to slice it and to look at what is the meaning of it, or how does it lead to an investment ultimately.
Do any of these tools that people have looked at or used define the boundary of the analysis differently depending upon the vulnerability? And is that where we're headed? So for example, the electric grid is one vulnerability. So you might define your geography differently than if you're looking at socioeconomic vulnerabilities.
I think we've talked about the common unit that we're layering on all those different factors as being the municipality, but I don't think we have to. I would be interested to see if maybe the consultant has some other ways of looking at it, because I would not claim that department's an expert in this area. I think kind of GMPs, you're dipping your toes in it from what I can tell too.
Yeah, what we did was we took a score for all of the indices, not just for electric. And if all, if certain communities had a vulnerability in all areas, then they would rise to the top.
To me, this all sounds like, the beginning of a wish list of what we want from this index. And, it could maybe form the basis for the scope of work, for a consultants. Like we would like, these are the things we'd like to be able to do with it. We'd like to be able to do it at all these different scales with all these different infrastructures or aspects of, humans, whether it's their health or their jobs or whatever. And, it probably, I use the word wish list because it probably is a wish list to be able to do all of those things. And, but to kind of like set the bar high and then see what's possible, just because even the kind of information that you can gather in a reasonable amount of time. And it just all sounds really challenging to me. But I think we should start by asking a question and then see what we can get, given the time constraint and, the resources that are available, money and time, what's possible technically and all of that.
Yeah, so speaking of money, Jane, I know that there was money budgeted for the Climate Council, and I just want to have like a gut check here on, whether there is funding available for bringing on additional contract support, especially when we talk about how this layers and or incorporates work on a vulnerability assessment and how a vulnerability assessment can feed into the climate action plan.
Yeah, so there was $800,000 in the budget for technical services components of the work. And obviously that first RFP will be the bulk of that $800,000, which is really around the emissions requirements. We have that RFP closed on Monday. We got 4 proposals, of which I'll just say any of the 4 could do the work. And so some are better at some of the components than others, but we're reviewing them on Monday as a team to recommend one of the consultants to move into the contracting price. And they varied in price from $380,000 to $780,000. So depending on who we select, there'll be some money left over. 2 of the strongest ones are right in the middle of that, are about $560,000. So likely we'll have somewhere around $200,000 to $300,000 to still have available for additional technical analyses, but we'll have a better idea of that next week. And yeah, certainly, I think a large component of that would be for this work. And then the other big one, and they really seem to almost have a lot of interplay, is whatever Just Transition Subcommittee thinks about doing, which we haven't talked about in a while, around mapping and really thinking about mapping frontline communities or impacted communities. And so, and as how that work plays with, which I think many of you have heard me mention, with ongoing work that's happening from an RFP and proposal that's happening for Department of Environmental Conservation right now. And so what we can piggyback there, but there will be funding in all cases for this work. And I would see this as a high priority need. Not many other contractual needs, I think, will rise to the top from other subcommittees. But I also have no idea what this would cost. So would look to any expertise from Mike or Ann about what's already been happening and what it's cost. And then I think it would be great to learn more about the tools that are out there. And I suggested this in the chat. It'd be great to have Leslie Ann join us for that. And Jay Schaefer obviously sits in as he can with this committee too, and make sure he was here for that. And then it'd be really great if we could hear from other states with state climate action plans, what they've done around this component of their plan. And I know Maine in particular would be happy to come and speak with us as one example.
I think.
Oh, and Jay Schaefer, he's the climatologist at Northern Vermont University, and he sits on science and data.
I don't know exactly what this is GMP so far. I think that there was a fellow that came from DOE to help, who was paid for by DOE for a year to help with it. So that definitely defrays some of the cost. And the department's applied under Vermont Emergency Management for some hazard mitigation grant funding to, I think it was for like $100,000 to kind of fill in the gaps for the rest of the state. But that's, we're not really sure if that's sort of adequate. And I think a lot of it depends on the platform. Is this going to be hosted by the state? It's going to be hosted by VCGI. What kind of bandwidth do they have to host it? Like, can we build on the state's inherent mapping capabilities and just be additive to that? Or does it need to be hosted offsite or built offsite? I think those are big questions around what the amount of funding would be. Populating it with the data is, that may be kind of once we decide what the data is and how available it is, that may be a lower cost part of the proposal.
Ben?
Yeah, I posted a link in the chat to the Department of Health Social Vulnerability Index. I encourage everybody to take a look at that and make dead certain that we understand what we already have and that the consultants that we engage understand what we already have. You can do an awful lot.
Yeah,
with what you already
I
have.
mean, when we talked about this with the work plan, we were talking about the fact that there are a lot of tools out there, and the part of the scope of work for some consultant support would be to have them do research and on all of the data sources that are out there and make a recommendation to this group on how to approach and how to develop a tool to develop a tool for assessing municipal vulnerability to climate change, so that we can have a tool that's available and be able to perform those assessments at the municipal level. So well, I think we definitely want to be clear that we're not looking for them to recreate data. This is about, utilizing sources that already exist, but it's very much, we will have to come to a decision point based on our expertise on what equals vulnerability in all of the different subsectors as they relate to municipalities, and then how the tool that's used to assess that. But I think there's a really important piece here, especially for the climate action plan, talking about vulnerability assessment on a statewide basis, and having maybe as a part of that contract, having them do a vulnerability assessment based on existing data sources on a statewide basis. And it would end up being a drilled down version of what the national climate assessment looks like. But I mean, we, like you said, we would be missing the so what piece. And if we don't have that and have a report on impacts to agriculture and ecosystems that's definitive and centralized and in one place, you're going to be kind of missing the so what.
So it
Oh,
sounds
go
like
ahead.
we have the makings of an upcoming agenda where we have the folks from the GMP come, or whoever that is, if they're from GMP or wherever, but hear about that model, maybe hear from Maine as well, and use that to help further this conversation.
Yeah, as well as Leslie Ann.
Yeah, and we'll make sure Leslie Ann and Jay are able to be there.
She was the lead for the Northeast chapter on the National Climate Assessment.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Yeah, she's.
Yeah, the Vermont, I have a meeting with the Gund Institute too next week, because the Vermont climate assessment is about to be unveiled. So that I'm not quite sure how that'll relate in, and I don't understand it enough yet to really know the impact. But Leslie Ann obviously is part of that, but it's bigger than just it's more specific to Vermont, but has more components to it than the national assessment does.
Are there any other thoughts or suggestions around how we should be crafting and thinking about how we search for contractual support for this piece of our work? Go ahead, Jens.
So I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge for this group, is one of scale. And I think we're going to need to just have it as part of our regular framework to think at different scales, because both the vulnerability and the solutions are going to occur at those different scales. So I think we might want to create a framework for kind of embedding that in this work. And so, yes, we can address that statutory requirement of that municipal scale, but also get a finer resolution unit and a coarser resolution unit in the index that'll allow us to look at those different scales. So then we can match the vulnerabilities at scale with solutions at scale.
All right, I see Jane is suggesting we do this on our agenda 2 weeks from now. Does that work for people? Okay.
Next week we have, this was also going to be part of the member updates, which was we have our public engagement folks that are going to come and talk with us and they've asked us to set aside an hour to talk with them. So that's what we'll be doing next week.
I think 2 weeks should give me enough time to make sure that I can have Sarah and Josh join us. So yes.
Okay. And Jane, will you be able to check with Leslie Ann? Great, thank you. And the main folks? Excellent.
We want to go on to the climate action plan framework.
Yeah, I'll just, before we do that, just invite any members of the public who are here. I put it in the chat that we're pretty informal and feel free to jump in, but I just wanted to say it out loud too. So don't be shy. You don't need to wait till the formal public comment at the end of the meeting if you have anything you want to add or want us to think about. Okay. So climate action plan framework discussion.
Thanks. I think this is me. I wanted to revisit our conversation that we had a few weeks ago, and then it came up at the Climate Council, and we didn't have time to get back to it last week. And so I don't want to spend like too much time thinking about this, because I really just think it's a framework for the climate action plan. But from this, in the coming weeks, I'll start to develop templates to provide you all to help inform your work. And so you'll remember that when we first talked about this, that the framework for the climate action plan was sort of obvious and flowed with respect to the mitigation components, but was sort of a little bit more open-ended to how we deal with the sequestration components as well as the resiliency components. And then just as a reminder, also as you're thinking at your task groups, the other thing that I think will be a challenge is to think about the scale at which and the level of detail that you build out for the strategies and recommendations that you put forward for this climate action plan, and what's sort of left for future plans. So thinking about how far you want to get with your strategies and recommendations for this plan is really important too. So I thought I would just show you and just remind you the shift that we made. So not much has changed in the sort of front and center components of the outline. But this section here, the effects of climate change on Vermont, I think that will also be a place where your work sort of feeds into, like I mentioned in my conversations with Leslie Ann this week. She's going to help me sort of flush out what that looks like. And then likely there might be even a chance when she joins, if she's able to join in a couple weeks with your meeting, that she could speak to that component of her outline too with me. But that section is, a lot of sort of building the so what, why should we care components, and then building from there, thinking about, again, those buckets of sort of the strategies that we need. Like we have to hit the ground running. We have to immediately go into rulemaking, think about policy, legislation, and they really speak to the fact that, just as a reminder, that this likely will be the only climate action plan developed comprehensively prior to hitting that 2025 statutory requirement of emissions reductions. So we need to ensure that the strategies here in immediate implementation under transportation, buildings, electricity, ag, the cumulative assessment of those actually get us to meet the emissions requirements. And that's where I talk about like their mandate in cross-sector mitigation is clearer than the mandate for other subcommittees. And so the strategies, then again, under sequestration, a lot of it comes at, the idea of how we think about how we track our emissions within a carbon budget, the natural and forested and natural land sequestration, and then the capacity of agricultural land sequestration. And then again, a cumulative assessment of what we're thinking about there. And, again, just to build expertise and knowledge here about the other components in the plan and in the law, I suspect that there'll be a lot of strategies and recommendations that advance more aggressive sequestration than is called for in the law, because as I think many of you already know, we're not required to be net zero until 2050, but if we meet the emissions targets that are set statutorily, we'll likely, if we stay at a similar sequestration rate to what we have in the state now, we'll be net zero in 2030-ish. And so where's the incentive to do better with land use planning and the conservation work and other things that get us to sequester more carbon long-term? So I suspect there'll be some strong strategies and recommendations about what we do with that component of the law, actually. And so here, you'll remember that under last time, the way I had teed this up was I took the work buckets that were in your work plans and sort of translated that to the best of my ability under the broad buckets of how you'll frame your strategies and recommendations coming out of this subcommittee, and they really didn't feel appropriate to any of you. And I think, and I'm asking you now, where we landed was really these broad buckets of community resilience, and then we decided that what needed to be called out separately was infrastructure resilience. And so I want to test that, and then just remind you that these nature-based solutions and really thinking about agricultural systems resiliency and economic resiliency, those are task leads and work groups in the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. But even today at their subcommittee meeting this morning, nature-based solutions, like they're calling it community resilience. I mean, first and foremost, that's the title. So it may not even still be like broken out to this level. It may all think under one heading, but for you all to think about what are the main buckets of work that you're working on and where do they fit into this outline would be really helpful for me. And then I think that where we left was thinking about community resilience in a really broad definition, but sorry, my phone is ringing while I'm trying to talk. And the comment here that I put that I'm having a hard time seeing because you're covering it, my people. So I was feeling like we still needed to define and discuss again how your work was going to fit into this bucket of community resilience. And I know we were thinking broadly about housing, health issues, and the built environment as your components. But then I also remembered that Joe had a really eloquent way of teeing it up, of sort of thinking about what are the threats posed by climate change, and then what are we doing to address those threats, and then thinking about how we organize the work appropriately based on that. So I haven't thought about this in a little bit, but I know that there was still sort of unfinished conversation when we last talked about this around how we framed the work coming out of this subcommittee. And I just, it doesn't have to be perfect right now, but I do just want to start to get a sense of, are we close? Is this starting to feel like your work can fit into this, and then use this as a chance to think about any gaps that we're missing in your subcommittee or broadly in the planning process. Lauren, I pause there since that was a lot. And again,
Go ahead, Jane. No, go ahead, Jane.
no, sorry, go ahead. I actually really wasn't going to say anything great. So go ahead.
So reactions to what Jane just laid out?
Yeah, so Chad here, I'm glad you pointed all that out, Jane. I think I do see some synergy here with our, rural resilience, which could include, our land, our working landscape, basically, and can we make improvements to that working landscape to be more amenable towards carbon sequestration? I think about the Biden infrastructure plan, which does include some language around monetizing landowners for improving their soil quality and vegetation such that they can be more well compensated, I guess, for keeping that working landscape in in its highest, most productive state. And I think that speaks really well to Vermont, right? We've got so much agricultural land, especially in the rural parts of the state. So if we can help sort of identify avenues for additional monetization for farmers through carbon capture, then that should be part of our charge. We should definitely be working with talking about the same nature-based solutions.
Yeah, I wonder, not sure, I'm not muted, right? Okay, I wonder if, because there is both an ag sequestration and carbon sequestration, like natural land sequestration task leads in ag and ecosystems, and they're surely thinking about, carbon credit programs, and then ag sequestration payments, and there's an ecosystem services work group out of AAFM, the ag agency, right now thinking about payments for ecosystem services. But it's interesting for me to think about then, well, yeah, they've kind of got that in natural and working lands, but what's the nexus then here? And how do you use that as a strategy to sort of hold up and build resilient rural communities? Because that's what we want to all be speaking to each other and making those connections, because it does do that. So yeah, I'm not quite there yet, but I know that Lauren is chairing the one on natural land, and then the sequestration and ag sequestration, the natural land sequestration and ag sequestration are different task groups too. So there's even so much cross-cutting that they're discussing within that task level, yet alone across subcommittees. But I suspect, on Monday, just as a little bit of an update and a point of contention, perhaps, is that we'll have our first steering committee meeting where the co-chairs will be present. And I'm terribly delinquent on sending out the agenda right now, but the agenda will include sort of an ask of a recognition by the co-chairs of any areas of overlap that they're already starting to pick up on with other subcommittees, and calling that out and sort of thinking about strategies on how to ensure that we're not too siloed in our work, and that we're speaking to those.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I need to jump off. I gotta get in the car. I'm gonna try to jump back on the Zoom in the car, but thanks for that, Jane.
Careful.
Thanks, Chad.
Enjoy the play.
Thank you.
I see Ian has his hand up. Did you want to jump in, Ian?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Ian Hitchcock, Vermont Natural Resources Council, Energy and Climate Program Associate. I just wanted to offer one note of caution around the idea of paying for ecosystem services. Obviously, in principle, that's something that I very much support, but the devil is very much in the details, right? Around how you make sure that what additional funds you are providing actually result in the kinds of, climate friendly practices, whether that's carbon sequestration or emissions reductions that you want to see. And it can be very difficult to figure out how to actually ensure that there's accountability for that, that you're not, unintentionally paying for practices that may not be having the effect that is advertised. So I just wanted to offer that note of caution. I obviously love the idea. I know farms are hurting a lot, and I very much am just like personally involved in climate action because I think that things like diversifying income streams for farmers can be one way of trying to address some of the longstanding economic inequities and struggles that people in our state are facing all over the place. So I very much love the idea, but I would hate for it to result in us, just largely paying people to do what they've been doing, or to struggle to know that we are actually getting what we want from that, which is actual sequestration, which I know there have been some struggles with in terms of even like international carbon markets and that sort of thing, making sure that the money that goes there is actually resulting in what we want to see.
Totally agree. Thanks. Ian.
And I think the question for us is how do those sorts of programs, actions impact our goals for resiliency and adaptation?
Yeah, you just said adaptation. I often feel like, and I wonder if adaptation is reflected enough in this outline.
Yeah, I think that's something we have to suss out a little bit. I think I see adaptation as kind of I see it more like adaptation are the strategies that you follow to provide resilience. You adapt to become more resilient. and so maybe that needs to be some, that's how I see it anyway. And maybe that just needs to be explained somewhere along the lines. And there is a definition for both adaptation and resilience in the act. They overlap. But anyway, I've been thinking about it that way. You adapt for a reason to become more resilient.
I think in this subcommittee too, I think somebody brought up that it could also be the reduction of greenhouse gases, right?
Catherine brought
No,
that.
so
No.
climate mitigation is the reduction of greenhouse gases. Climate adaptation is exactly what Joe said. It's those actions that lead to resilience. But it gets confusing because hazard mitigation is a form of climate adaptation.
Right.
But I did know a couple of things. One, we do have in our task the best practices recommendations for rural greenhouse gas reductions. But I did note that one of the questions I have at an earlier meeting, Mike, was, where does the human adaptation that's going to be required as part of all of these strategies come into play in this conversation and in the plan?
Yeah, buying an electric vehicle is adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
So, so when we look at how this is framed and we cross-reference that with what we have in our work plan for tasks, do folks see kind of a natural progression from our tasks to what's going to be needed to fulfill this section of the climate action plan?
Well, there's some things like the vulnerability index, which we've already talked quite a bit about this afternoon. That fits into this framework, or if it even needs to. Or if it just is something that's kind of an appendix in the action plan of, we were asked to develop a vulnerability index. Here it is. Although it might be a tool that's kind of used for prioritization or for assessment of a strategy, ideally that's how it might be used. Whether or not we can kind of get there in this, first version of the action plan, I don't know. I kind of doubt it. To have a tool that's sophisticated to be able to evaluate all these strategies, I think is going to be unlikely. But anyway, that's just an example of something that's on that list that, of our work program that I'm not sure totally fits into this, but somehow we have to address that because we were asked to do that in the action plan. I don't have the rest of our work program in front of us, but is there anything else like that that's not really just about identifying the strategies to improve resilience?
That component that you just spoke to, Joe, is it's sort of along the lines of what Leslie Ann said. Like there's going to be this mapping and this story to tell, right? And I think that and where does that fit in? And that's some of the thinking that she's doing with this outline on our behalf.
Okay.
But I agree with you, it doesn't fit neatly yet.
For me, I wonder about having nature-based solutions as a separate category when it sort of feeds into all of the other categories, each one of them. And so I want it to give it its due by having its own section, but also think it's so closely related to all the others. It makes me wonder if it'll get lost if it's just as its own section.
Like, so that's what was coming up for me today too, Jens. And I wonder if like nature-based solutions is a strategy, right? That fits under a lot of different buckets. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been struck. It's the word solutions too that, just sort of implies that it's there.
Yeah.
I was wondering about economic and food systems. Aren't those two different things?
Yeah, I think it's really, they have it called this within ag and ecosystems, but it's really, I think, the economics of food systems in the face of a changing climate. So I think that that's why I was trying to explain it for you. But yeah, that's right.
So we're coming up on the time before we have to move on to the next subject. So I just want to be sure we have provided our feedback on this to the extent that we want to today.
It feels like I'm happy to hear more comments, and maybe I'll just stop sharing so I can see you all. But it seems like I'll circle back with Lauren Oates, who's the head of the nature-based solutions one, and think with her about just sort of standing that up as a strategy that'll be cross-cutting across many areas, and see how she feels about that. And then it also feels like perhaps Leslie Ann's thought and work, and hopefully her contribution, if she can come to an upcoming meeting, to think about the bigger picture and think especially mapping tools and storytelling might help us fit some of the other sort of concrete statutorily required tools that are supposed to come out of this subcommittee into the plan. But for now, it does feel like if community resilience is really a catch-all, we can think about that, and infrastructure resilience, recognizing that that's a more costly separate one. Well, maybe not more costly, but just a big bucket of work to call out separately. And that feels like enough right now, understanding that not all of the tools and systems that you're working on will fit in neatly, but we'll be thinking about that ongoingly. Ongoingly, that's what you really need to add to ongoing.
We want to move on to our update to the Rural Caucus of Legislators.
I just wanted to, you guys will all remember, and then it's good to just make sure we accurately represent this, but Representative Sibilia, who joined us at one of these meetings and was instrumental in thinking about appointments on the council like Erica's and Catherine's to represent the interests of rural communities, has asked Erica and Catherine and I to come to the regularly scheduled Thursday morning breakfast meeting of the Rural Caucus, is the way I perceive it, where they talk about things related to their interests, and have asked Erica and Catherine specifically to speak to the substantive work happening at this subcommittee, and sort of speak to the interests of that caucus and how that work is being represented through the work plan for this subcommittee. So we just wanted to provide that as an update, and think of if anything that you all might want to think about as a highlight for that committee or that caucus and how we present it.
I'm curious who's in that caucus too. I don't know if you can get us that information. That would be helpful.
Erica, did you know offhand, Erica, better than I do? I don't know, but I'd be happy to share that I can share that via email.
Got to be a big caucus.
Yeah.
Entire-
Vermont.
The entire house.
Yeah. Yeah. The Vermont house. Yeah. Yeah. They seem very interested. And they're one of the ones, one of the things I keep thinking that we can share with them, Eric and Catherine, is they want to know what's happening, right? And they want to know, and other legislative committees like House and Technology and Energy also want to be kept apprised. And so one of the ideas that I've thought about with Secretary Young is that these check-ins with the co-chairs at the steering committee are only going to be 1 hour long. They'll be recorded. There'll be an easy place, perhaps, that we can point legislators to, just watch this one video and you get a brief snapshot in at all the subcommittees. So we've been thinking about that as one tool to keep legislators informed of what's happening at different subcommittees.
Are you just informing them, or is it an opportunity to ask for any feedback? Well, I mean, they give feedback anyway, but, and I was thinking what do they see as the challenges that climate change poses in rural communities? And that might be help us think about some strategies, or are we capturing kind of what they're thinking about?
I was hoping to be able to ask some questions like that for them to give us some feedback too.
Great.
And they probably want to talk more than they want to listen.
You should know, right, Ben?
I have actually gone and presented to, for instance, Representative Sebelia's area that she represents with maps that we've talked about here today, with climate plan actual rollout. So it is odd because some of this is happening already in the private sector, right? Where we're having the outreach, we're having the meetings, we're already doing that with some of the people that are going to be in that caucus. So that's why I was curious who was in there. So they've already seen some of this in action, I guess is what I'm saying.
That's good to know. So if we talk about that part of the work, we will make sure that they know that none of us want to reinvent anything.
I think there's also, I'm sorry, I think there's also a message for that group that the strengths of the rural communities are what's going to lead to rural resilience. The fact that there's so much natural land, so many natural lands is adding to the resilience of that landscape. And that's a really important message because they so often think of those, things as detriments, and here they're ecosystem services that are waiting, that are helping them. And so it's not just a drawback to have a lot of natural land in terms of economic development, it's a huge asset in the context of climate resilience.
Well said, again. Thank you for that. My comment before was just gonna say to Mike that very timely, your comment, because I was speaking with Council Member Liz Miller yesterday, and she was commenting on how I was reflecting the public engagement as just starting now with the consultants. And she's like, it's not just starting now, we've been doing all different council members, subcommittee members, we've all been doing outreach and engagement, and we have to think of it as a continuum, with just these milestones at this point with the contractors, and not think of it as just starting and ending. It's a continuum. And so it was nice to hear you then bring that up. So thanks.
To be clear, it wasn't as a council member, but still it was as a climate plan to help address resiliency. So.
Well, we can report. That's all great, and I appreciate that message, Jensen. We can coordinate a little bit more, Erica and Catherine, on what Celia sent back to me and what she wanted to just know that we can be brief and give them questions and talk.
And I'm out Monday and Tuesday, so we should coordinate Wednesday.
Right before it. That sounds great to me.
And Jane noted that she'll send the list of the caucus members out. And in response to that, if you have any key points that you want to make sure that we're either are aware of or make note of when you see that list, definitely let us know. Or when we leave the meeting and you have some time to think about it. And we'll report on how that went when we do our member updates at our next meeting.
Awesome. We can move on to public comment. Do any of the members of the public like to say anything?
I mean, this is Ian again. I'll just want to note of appreciation of the work that you guys are doing. I feel like you guys don't hear thank you enough, and I know this is really hard. So thank you for trying to wrap your arms around these giant bear and figure out y'all's place in it. I think the engagement with Rep. Sibilia in particular, just from like observing her interest in and really being a driving force for this, will be very valuable to all of y'all, I think, in terms of understanding where she's coming from and like where, why for her getting this subcommittee going was such an important piece of making the Global Warming Solutions Act something that is valuable to Vermont above and beyond the value to Vermont that comes from doing our part on climate. So I am glad to hear that y'all are doing that, and yeah, no, this isn't easy. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for that note, and Dale for your comment. And we appreciate all of you who come to these meetings who don't have to be here, because you come just because you want to be, not because you agree to be a member of the subcommittee. I see, Ben, you have your hand up too.
Yep, I just wanted to take the opportunity to, as promised, keep the drumbeat going for the urgency of including in our plans and proposals a state hazard mitigation funding program. We're right up against it right now with the non-federal match for some long worked on hazard mitigation projects, such as the Vermont River Conservancy's floodplain restoration project on the Whetstone Brook, that helps to protect downtown Brattleboro. It's part of a multi-phase, multi-million-dollar vision to have downtown Brattleboro coexist more safely with the flood-prone Whetstone Brook. And we've gone through all the FEMA reviews, the EHP review, and the hazard. It's just been a tremendously challenging process. And now we're getting to the starting line, and we don't have a clear answer on where the 25% non-federal share is coming from. So, we were hoping that we might have something from the governor's proposal this year. I guess we'll get another bite at getting an allocation of ARPA money from the legislature in January, but it's very urgent from where we sit. So thank you.
Thanks for that comment, Ben. Other thoughts before we wrap up for the day? Oh, sorry. Great.
Ready?
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend, and we'll see everybody next week.
Show your mom some love.